Hello everyone, I am Bob Lingle of Off the Beaten Path Bookstore in Lakewood, New York, and this is the Weaponized Literacy Podcast. Over the past year, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with investigative reporters, social activists, astrophysicists, philosophers, military veterans, and just plain old writers. We discuss life, death, and all of the things that happen in between. Our goal is to use the power of the written word to create a better understanding of the world around us and the people that live in it. We do this by reading with purpose, and we invite you to join in our effort to weaponize literacy. Hello everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. Our guest tonight is a practitioner of Black Girl Magic and holds a master's degree in creative writing from Eastern Michigan University. When she is not writing, Kayla is found at the museums where she works or telling everybody about the history of popular music and social dance. She is a former line editor and contributing writer for Cecile's Writers. Her previous work can be found in the Blue Pages Journal and Honey and Lime Literary Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, Kayla Chenault.
Hello. Hi, Bob.
Thanks for joining us tonight, Kayla.
Thank you for having me tonight. It's really great to be here.
So Kayla is the author of These Bones. Can you give us a synopsis of what the story is about?
Yes. So These Bones is a magical realism horror, literary horror book that is the generational history of one town over the course of the first half of the 20th century. And there are many mysterious and fantastical figures that bring all of this terror, but you find out that the real terror is the racism we meet along the way.
It does check a lot of genre boxes. And you had written the original form of These Bones as a part of your master's thesis?
Correct, yes. So I started These Bones when I was in grad school as part of a class on collage writing. And then pretty much the first half of it was my master's thesis. And I decided that I really loved it and I didn't want to leave that particular space. So I decided to keep working on it from there.
And can you tell us more about what collage writing is? Because it was a new term for me, and it really I feel like it explains the structure of the book well.
Absolutely. So collage writing is basically the idea is that you're taking all of these disparate elements and genre conventions and different artistic styles and blending them together to tell one complete narrative. And so in These Bones, there are parts that are newspaper articles, and there are parts that are chapters in other books, and there is at least one actual quote that exists that is in the real world. And at one point when it was my master's thesis, there was a song in it. So it has all of these various pieces that come together to tell the cohesive story of this place.
And it was really just very interesting. My background, what I aspired to originally be in when I was going to college, but I am so thankful it didn't work out that way, was documentary film. And I felt like these were the pieces of a documentary film telling this story of the Bramble Patch. So I really appreciated the structure there.
Oh, thank you. I love that you brought up documentary film because I'm from the same hometown as Ken Burns, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ooh. And so maybe I was influenced by the Burns effect all of my life.
Yes. And if you haven't read the story already, I do recommend. I did not have the character list in the copy that I received, but when you pick up the book, it's a thin one, and you look at the character list and like, how could I possibly need a character list for a book this small? But you need it. Use that as a reference and as a guide, because you packed so much into this book, and that is a very useful resource.
Thank you. Yeah. As I looked back, I was like, well, I know who all of these characters are, but they'd been in my head for years at that point. So yes, the character list is important.
For the writing process and more so the research process, how much research did you have to put into this story?
I did a fair bit of research. I did a lot of reading of other fiction writers, particularly other African American fiction writers. But I also spent a lot of time diving into the history. So, like it says in my bio, I have worked in museums for the past 6 years. And so being able to bring in some of the work that I've already done in museums and apply that to the process of writing this was really like amazing. Um, One of my favorite things to just research was the in one of the original drafts of this book, the writing style of the magazine article that appears towards the end, and looking at I bought old copies of Time magazine on eBay and Life magazine too, and I started flipping through and looking at their feature articles and reading how they're written and the kind of the prose that was there, and to the extent that in when I my first draft of it, I even formatted it with like matching the font as well as I could to the actual font in the Life magazine articles from 1949. So it was really kind of fun to kind of dive into the intricacies of that history. Sorry,
That's,
my dog wants to join us today.
that's okay. Bring him in. And for what was the initial inspiration for this story?
So at the same time that I was in my collage writing class, I was going to visit a friend who lived about an hour or so away. And as I was driving to my friend's house, she lives out in the country. I passed this old church, and it was this like old clapboard, one sanctuary style church. The paint had been completely stripped. It had been long since abandoned. There were the trees growing out of it, all this foliage around it. And I just had this thought of, well, what would happen if somebody who had seen that church in its heyday was able to see it now and see it kind of forgotten? And it reminded me of a StoryCorps story that I had heard not that long beforehand about an African American man who was talking about growing up at the cusp of the end of segregation, and how while integration overall was good for society, the white town around the Black community he lived in slowly but surely started closing down factories and other places where the majority of African Americans worked, so that the families that were Black were forced to move away. And so they didn't have to integrate their school system. And I thought about the impact of integration on a micro level, because we often talk about it from the macro level of it being a positive thing, and it is. But the micro levels in which society not being ready to integrate ended up kind of harming a lot of communities, including where I live in Michigan.
Mm-hmm. And we, from the Native American aspect, there's a larger Native American population in our community in upstate New York. There's just been so much more conversation about the integration, but so much of like the forced integration and the reform schools, and how we've just tried to eliminate the cultures away from people. So that I appreciate you looking at it from that perspective. What was it a struggle for you to blend these genres, and how were you making the decisions of what were you going to incorporate into the story?
I think in the editing process, I think that's where, or as I was writing second and third and fourth drafts, I think that's where it became kind of difficult to keep finding new voices and expanding on certain aspects. Part of it is because as I was writing, I'd get really into one voice, and then I'd write and write and write in that one voice, and I'd look back and say, "Oh wow, there's a lot in just this one voice,"
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of overshadowing other things. So let me try to cut back some of the perspective of one character. I know there is in the book there is a chunk that is very like it is one voice the entire time for a large chunk. But I think that it tells a very compelling story, and so that I did want to keep um, as with all of the integrity it had as I was writing it. But even as I was trying to figure out, like, well, who should be telling these stories in the first place, it became very difficult to try to find, well, who should we eliminate from these narratives. I wanted to avoid as much as possible sticking to hearing from the narratives of um, narratives of the majority talking about the community, unless it was commentary on the actual events that were happening and the actual lives of the people, not just a back view like, oh, this is the black section of this town and we are separate from them, but actually giving those white majority voices a sense of commentary that is also being informed by black voices.
That's great. We frequently have aspiring writers or people interested in writing participating in these virtual author events, myself being one of them. I'm on day 10 of NaNoWriMo right now. So I'm plugging along. I've tried to just write a little bit each day, but I liked how you incorporated so many different voices into your project, because the project that I'm working on now, I struggled to figure out what the voice was. Like, I knew the story that I wanted to tell, but I didn't know who should be telling it and who they should be telling it to. So once I figured out that obstacle, I can commiserate with how difficult that decision can be. How long from beginning to end did it take you to? You had your master's part of it.
Yeah. So from initial conception to publication was about 4 years, but I will say that a good chunk of that was me not touching it after I was done with grad school, because I was like, ooh, I did the big thing and I got over that hill, and isn't it great? And let me just leave it here I'll leave it in a save file on my computer and just dive into things. But when COVID happened, I think like a lot of people, I had suddenly a lot of time because I wasn't doing anything but working from home. And I went back and I reread it, and I really still loved it, and I wanted to keep telling those stories. And so then I ramped it back up. So from that point, which I think would be like draft number 2 to publication, was about 16 months.
Okay. And because we've done so many events with Lanternfish Press, I always like to figure out or find out how you got involved with them. How many different publishers did you submit to during that process?
So I will say I am the anomaly. I'm the person that everybody tells you not to be. I sent it to Lanternfish first because they had an open call for submissions, and they specifically, when I was doing research, I was like, oh, they're looking for voices that sound like what I wrote. And so I'll send it to them first. And I remember correctly, they didn't allow simultaneous submissions. So I said, I'll send it to them first. And what I remember happening was I sent it to them. And as you know, as a writer, it takes a really long time to hear back from publishers. So I waited and I waited and I waited. And one day I woke up and I said to myself, okay, if they reject it, it's going to be all right. If they reject it, I will go back. I will rework some things because I know it needs work, and I can refine it, and then I can move on to another publisher. And it just so happened that 15 minutes before I woke up and said this, I actually received my acceptance from Lanternfish. So I opened my email, and there it was, like, oh, like, congratulations, we're going to be publishing your book. And that was absolutely incredible. But that is very against the advice that most people would give you. Even myself, I would say, like, often, like, go out to different publishers, but also do research on what different presses, especially small presses, do, and if your voice fits with them. That was like the big thing for me, was when I was looking at what they did, I was like, that's what I do. So yeah.
It's been interesting with doing these virtual events. We've kind of connected with Lanternfish, Steerforth Press, Biblioasis out of Ontario. And it just seems like each one, they're just kind of developing their own team of people. So once especially Lanternfish, I've done a lot of interviews with them, and Steerforth is the second most. You see just in the individual, not even in their work, like, all right, this is the kind of person that they're looking for.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of touched on this of balancing the change in perspectives and writing styles. Who are some of your writing influences?
Um, when I think the biggest influence on me as just a Black woman writer is Toni Morrison, especially a Black woman writer from the Midwest. She has a very distinct voice, and the way she's able to capture these stories about Black life in a Northern context has always been something I've really loved. And I love that you asked this question because, like many people, as soon as you ask me, like, who are some writers you love, I'm like, what's a book? Marie Ann Michelmore wrote the book. It's a YA novel called When the Moon Was Ours, and it is to this day, I think, one of the most beautiful books I've ever read in my life. I am so in love with it. I cannot get enough of it. It's the first book I always recommend to people. I'm going to Bonnie Jo Campbell is another writer. She's a Michigan writer, so I love her. But also, I got to see her at a bookstore event many years ago, and listening to her talk about her craft made me want to dive in and love it and love writing with that sort of passion. So I think those are my three big influences. I love that they're all women writers that I just said. But also, I was recently telling a family member who had read the book. They're like, we were talking about other influences, and I said, "Oh, I really like the movie Pan's Labyrinth, so I really like Guillermo del Toro." And I think having thought back on the book, I was like, "Oh yeah, I definitely like Guillermo del Toro. You can tell." But yeah.
Do you ever feel like there have too much influence on you, where you're going back and you're reading something and like, that was a little bit too much Morrison there?
Yes, I'm always worried. I've always been worried about that. I'll give you an example, and it's not of those authors, but there's a section in the book where it is from the perspective of a 3-year-old. And I spend a lot of time with kids working in museums, so I'm used to like hearing how kids talk and how they think and how, you'll ask them a question and they'll raise their hand and they'll tell you about a time they saw a mouse, and you're like, great, but we're talking about, something else entirely different. But one of the big influences on that particular section was me reading, was me reading Faulkner. And I went back and reread it. I was like, I really hope this does not sound too much like Faulkner. Yeah. Like, I'm like praying it doesn't, and I don't think it does. But when I was first writing it, back when in the original draft in grad school, I was like, this is very Faulkner. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I hope it doesn't sound too derivative.
I have run into that issue. Chuck Palahniuk is one of my favorite writers, and there's been different short story projects that I've worked on where I've read them like, I was just trying to. This is too much Chuck, and I don't have a voice. So,
I think oh my goodness, I think it was Ray Bradbury who, when he first got his typewriter, the first thing he did was type up The Great Gatsby, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
This is an anecdote, but the reason he did it was so that he could feel in his hands what it felt like to write like the great American novel. And I just thought that was I think that's such a fascinating concept that like we can take those influences, and even if it's just simple as like, yep, I'm just going to keep repeating and like remixing the things I've absorbed, but I think it makes us better writers in some way.
Definitely. Did you know where your story was going, as in terms of the whole story arc, and how not to have any spoilers in this, but where the story was going to end? Did you have a finish line, or were you?
This is hard to not get into spoilers about that particular question. So I knew that I wanted it to end like that, fairly early on, but I didn't know how the journey was going to go. So it was when I started writing, it was a very different story. It focused a lot on the Barghest and a lot more on Esther and a lot more on Jessup, who is a character who shows up in the beginning and is not there at the end because it's such a long history of this place.
Mm-hmm.
And initially it was going to be way more compacted in time, and I knew that I wanted certain things to happen, but as I started writing, the more I was interested in telling this longer arc of what was going to happen and diverting into the stories of these other characters and, you know, hearing from people who might even be nameless in some ways. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And I just want to mention, if anyone is watching on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and you do have questions, feel free to use the comment feature on those platforms, and we will do our best to answer them. So throughout the book, especially in the beginning, I always try to find the themes that the author may or may not have been going for, but hope seemed like a theme that was a part of the book. But it was a messy kind of hope. Can you talk about what was that an intentional theme with the story? Or am
Yeah, I think that it was, because I mean it's a very bleak story in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, but I always knew that the bleakness of it would be counteracted by the hope of the people around it.
Mm-hmm.
So, to kind of dive in a little bit more to that answer, when I first wrote it, it was actually not in sequential order. It was not in chronological order, which it is as you read it now. And so there was a lot more of these parallels that were happening, but throughout time. And one of the sequences that appears at the end, which involves two white characters. It's so hard not to spoil anything. But Peter, Ailey, and Penelope. Peter, Ailey, and Penelope at the end. He says this thing, or Penelope says, "Oh, the Bramble Patch is gone," because, like I don't think that's much of a spoiler because
Yeah.
it's mentioned in the very beginning. The Bramble
Mm-hmm.
Patch eventually, as a concept, this black part of this town is destroyed. But Peter says over and over again, but the people are still here. That the people who lived here are now integrated into the society, and their stories, which are told in this book, are still around. And I think that's the hope that I always wanted to cling to, was this idea that even if a place is gone, the people who lived in it and loved in it and enjoyed it and had good moments and bad moments, they still exist. I don't. Oh gosh, I'm getting emotional only because I've been thinking a lot. So I'm already working on my second book, and I've been thinking a lot about my relationship with my grandmother and my grandmothers and my great grandmothers. One of whom is still alive, and my mom's grandmothers both came from the south up to the north in the 1940s around the same time, and they
Mm-hmm.
both lived in this area of Detroit called Black Bottom, which no longer exists. But and part of my research with my job, but also part of the research I did as part of working on these bones, was to look at that community specifically, this community where I have roots in,
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that the city ended up tearing it down to build the freeway, but all of the stories of this community still exist, that my roots are still in this community that's no longer there. And I find that to be so amazing and uplifting in some ways, that things can be gone, but they still have echoes throughout time.
And is that, I wanted to get into the recurring line of these bones are going to rise again. Is that a part of that? I was looking more for like the meaning of that phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I mean, I think I mentioned it in the very beginning, that it's part of an old spiritual that was used around the time that came about around the time that Jim Crow started happening, and it's very the spiritual talks about how God made a man, but these bones are going to rise again. It's all about this idea that people will die, but they will come back. And I loved that as a motif as I was writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept coming back to that particular song because it was it has this sort of joyous element with this really dark tone as
Mm-hmm.
well. If you look online, you can find, I think, really old recordings of it from the 20s and 30s of people singing it, and it's like very well, the people died and all this stuff happened, but these bones are going to rise again, and I love that as a motif.
That's great. I wanted to, and it might not be helpful at all for you, but I wanted to throw a book recommendation your way in terms of the migration from the south to the north. Officer Clemens, the guy who played Officer Clemens on Mr. Rogers, his memoir details his mother and his aunts. There was a whole collection of women that were living in the South, and the men in their life were not treating them well. There was obviously a lot of racism in the South. And then they moved up to a small town in Ohio, which Ohio is pretty much equally racist as the South in hindsight for them. But it is a really interesting migration story of how they moved out of that area and were able to create their own lives. So just throwing that out for you. I love the book. I just brought in more copies to our store.
That is a perfect recommendation for me. Right. So thank you. That's awesome.
And we've got a few questions from Dean, so we'll see what we can do with these. Where did you come up with the names for all of your characters?
Okay, first of all, hi Dean. I should also mention, so Dean and I worked together, and Dean actually did an amazing, he just curated an amazing exhibit about the history of Black Bottom using oral histories of people who grew up in that area, and it's absolutely amazing. So if you happen to be coming to Michigan anytime between now and next year, please go see it. It's amazing. But so Dean, to answer your question, some of the names came from looking. I am a research nerd, and I love going down a good Wikipedia rabbit hole. So some of the names actually came from me researching and keeping lists of names, interesting names I found that would pop up in censuses. That's the word. From the 1800s. So Jessup came up. A few of the names are biblical, like Esther. One of the characters' names, Medir, is named after not a blood relative, but an in-law in our family who she was born in the early 1900s. She died at the age of 106. Still clear-minded, everything, lived in her own home until she was like 104. So that character's named, Medir is named after her. And but the characters of the Barghest and Juan Hope are named for some old English lore. So Juan Hope actually means without hope. It is an old English term that was used in poetry. And the Barghest is kind of like a big black dog, like the Grimm, if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. And I thought those were really interesting names, and I loved the idea of blending some elements of like English and Irish folklore into this story about Black Americans.
All right, we've got a second question from Dean. If you could cast these bones, who would you choose to play the Barghest?
Oh my goodness. Forrest Whitaker would be my first choice. I always imagine somebody who could have a commanding presence, who had like a little bit of an off-kilter look, and could portray mean, but also could portray charming. It's that balance where people keep coming to his. So, he's a pimp. He runs he runs a brothel. So people keep frequenting his establishment, but he's really bad. He's a terrible person. So he has to, somebody who could ride that line between those two places. I think that is who I would pick. But also, now that I think about it, Don Cheadle would also be kind of cool.
Okay.
So, yeah.
In my mind, when I was reading it, I was picturing Tony Todd, who played Candyman.
I love that. Oh, wait, hold on. I think I'm going to change my answer to yours.
I had, I'm the youngest of my siblings, and my sister now can't stand horror movies. I can't either now. But she would just have me watch all these horror movies. Candyman was one that I couldn't watch. And then the next opportunity that I had to watch Candyman was at a film festival in Pennsylvania, and Tony Todd was there sitting in the theater just like a few rows from where I was. I'm like, this is not the experience that you want when you're sitting just rows from Candyman. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so scary. Okay, yeah, no, I like that. I like that answer. I'm taking it. Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome. And then a third question from Dean. What was it like to write historical fiction as a historian?
It is both a challenge and also very easy. Part of it is that, like, with all of the background information that I have to keep in my head for work, there was just things I was able to just like recall and just put that in there and slide that in like a small detail or something that I had read and researched and say, well, I have precedent for this. So if my editor comes back and is like, I don't know if anyone would do this in the 1800s, it'd be like, haha, here's this obscure article from 1896 that says that so-and-so did this in Cleveland. That sort of thing. But I'm finding this difficult now working on my next book, where one of the big issues I am having is I'll get into this research rabbit hole and I'll be like, yes, this is what I love. I love this setting. I love this idea. Let's keep going. And then realizing halfway through the research rabbit hole that I might have gotten some of the facts incorrect, but I've already started writing. So I have to go back and figure out, all right, how do I want to do this? What about this place and this space at that time is thematically resonant to the book I want to write? Why does it matter if it's set here? Why can I fudge the history? Will somebody come up to me and be mad at me because I got my facts wrong? Another very brief story, and I'll just say this because Dean is the person asking this question. We worked on a project once where we wrote something about the founder of the city of Detroit, and it's very hard to get straight answers about people who were born in 1670s. Excuse me. So sometimes it's rumors passed down over generations. And I wrote this episode about this guy, and I did this research, and I thought I was solid, and I got a scathing email from this woman who said, how dare you? Here's 15 ways you were wrong. And I was like, this is very obscure history. Like, I did not know this was somebody's bag, but it is. And I think that's one of the things I'm always worried if someone's going to come up and be like, skating history, like, this is a niche that I'm into, and I'm going to call you out for it. So I tried to be purposely vague. That is why the Napoleonville is a not real setting. But it is, in my head, it has always been in a real place, and that is Illinois. And I picked Illinois because of some historical resonance of things that happened. In Illinois, similar to Ohio, has a vibe of both being, it's definitely the North, but it's also kind of the South, and some areas of Illinois. If you're south of Chicago, like it's basically that. So, yeah, it's a hard balance sometimes.
Yeah, a friend of mine is a historian, gets a lot into the history of Buffalo, and he on social media has shared some of the hate mail that he has received for the minor potential inaccuracies that he's had.
It is wild. Like, this is why I don't think I'll ever try to write anything set in the Civil War, because Civil War people are like, and they will fight you. Oh my goodness. So I'm like, yeah, nope, not going to touch the Civil War. That's not, nope, way over there, please. Thank you. That sort of stuff. So yeah.
The project that I'm working on now is very much autobiographical, but gets into like my dad's history with Vietnam, and I've had fun with looking back into our own history and seeing like just Wikipedia in dates, or doing the on this date Google searches of what was happening on this date. And there was like one random situation that was like a very critical day in our life. And it was also the day that Oscar Pistorius had the Olympic or the had killed his girlfriend. Like that was the big news story that day. And I'm like, all right, I'm like, we were in the waiting room of a hospital. That's probably what we were watching. So the history can be fun as long as you don't upset somebody along the way. Do you have any, and this can be a tough question, but do you have any advice for aspiring writers or younger writers?
Ooh, this is a tough question.
Or older writers that are new.
Yeah. My first piece of advice is tell a story that you want to hear. I remember as a kid, I think like many writers, my computer is like littered with juvenilia from when I was like a little kid and I first figured out how to type stuff, and I was just wanting to tell all of these stories, but I always so I kept cultivating until I kind of came to a place where I was really developing my own voice and telling stories that I thought were interesting and compelling, and going back and even thinking about one of the first things I tried to write as a kid was just a retelling of a book I liked, but I wanted to tell it from another perspective. So I was just like, I'm gonna type this. I was 7, like, yes, I'm gonna retell this story. So tell the stories you want to hear and read. I am a huge fan of free writing. I think that is the big thing that helps me get over writer's block, because sometimes I think we all hit that wall where it feels like I cannot get over it. So I just tell people, just free write. It does not have to be related to what you were working on, but just get something on paper as often as you can. And also, I think one of the big things is like, just don't be kind to yourself in the process of writing. I have found that I think this is true of every writer I know, where we get really down on ourselves. But you are creating something whole cloth from your imagination that did not exist until you put it on paper. And that is a very hard process. You're creating people. You are working in, I think, one of the most grand acts of human empathy, because you are empathizing with people who don't even exist, and that's hard, and that can be draining and emotional. And I think that being kind to yourself through the process of writing and through the process of editing is very important. I do have one last piece of advice.
Yeah.
Rejection. Sorry.
Keep it coming.
Rejection is normal. I have been rejected so many times with things that I've been working on, and even the things you really believe in and are passionate about. The rejection is normal, but it is not necessarily a reflection on you as a person or even you as a writer. You might just not be what that one place was looking for. But when you find the right place, you will be in a great position to do the work that you want to do, and you will have a team around you that will help you create the story and flesh it out and refine it until it is a beautiful work of art. So yeah.
That's great advice.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for giving it. Because writing, it's an art form, and when you put it out in the world, people have their own interpretations of it. But what do you hope, without spoilers, people take away from your book?
I think the idea of hope is what I hope people take away from it. I think that, like I said, it's a dark book at times, but I think that there is light in it, and that the characters in this book, even when things are very bad, constantly strive for the light, and that light still remains at the end of the day, I think, is a very important thing. But I also hope that this book encourages folks to dive deeper into some of the forgotten histories of this country. I mean, we are really having a reckoning in this country right now with what history means and whose histories we get to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And there are pieces of this book that are based in things that happened in reality, and that I hope that it drives people to further learn these stories, because they are important stories to tell.
I'm gonna put you on the spot. Other than your book, on that note, are there any books that you can recommend that would also explore that? I'll give you the first answer of Stacey Flood's The Salt Fields also explores that.
Absolutely. If you are a nonfiction reader and you have a lot of time, because it's a very thick book, but I think it's one of the best written narrative nonfiction books, The Warmth of Other Suns dives really deep into some of that history that informs what's going on in my book. I'm trying to think. This is very on the spot.
Recommendations are hard, yeah.
They are hard.
You can get back to us.
I was going to say, I will say the book Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. If you have not read it, it's really good. It's her first novel, but deals again with some of the things that I am dealing with. I will say a book. I did not read this book when I was writing mine, and absolutely did not engage with any media involved with this thing until after my book was on the way to being published. But if you have not read Lovecraft Country, I think my book and that book have a lot of parallels in talking about some of those hidden histories, and I think people who watched the TV show will also attest to that. But I think that book does a really good job of fleshing out some more of that history too.
Okay. If there's no other questions from the audience, Kayla, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I just thought of another book.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. The book Cain by Jean Toomer, which was written in the 1920s. It is a series of short stories. Half of the book takes place in the South, the other half takes place in the North, and it's these different stories of Black life that that's very much so scandalized W.E.B. Du Bois, but I think it's one of the best books ever written about during the Harlem Renaissance. I really do.
What's the spelling of Cain?
Cane, C-A-N-E, like sugar cane.
Okay. All right. Beyond any other book recommendations, which you are nailing them now.
Just coming up with, oh my goodness. I really hope people do enjoy these boats. And please shop at local bookstores. Small local bookstores are absolutely amazing. This is I'm not just saying this because I am talking to you right now. This is in my personal life. This is my personal soapbox. Small local businesses, always the best way to go. It's the holiday season coming up. And so if you want to buy books, including these bones, you probably want to buy them now from your local bookstores. They really appreciate it. As an author, I really appreciate it because I get to do these cool events with different bookstores. And Jeff Bezos doesn't need your money. So I think that's a win-win for everybody.
That's very true. We've been doing, especially last month, mystery boxes. We do curated book boxes, which is the same thing as a mystery box, just fancier name. But they got us through when we were shut down for 2.5 months when we weren't allowed to be open in New York State and a lot of other states. And then we brought them back after a viral TikTok from a store in Nebraska. and it's been really big for us, but it's been fun because we've been doing so many virtual events that I don't know if anybody who received a copy of these bones in their curated book box, but I sent out several around the country. So I let them know that the event was going on. So hopefully they tuned in. I appreciate your plug for independent bookstores. So yes, we have these bones in stock in our bookstore. If you're not from the area, you can go to obpbooks.com and order a copy through there. You can also pop into your local bookstore and say, hey, do you have this? If not, order it in. And I do want to just plug we have 2 events coming up next week, and they're our last 2 virtual events for the year. And then I'm taking a break so I can focus on how busy we will hopefully be during the holiday shopping season. But a week from today, we'll be talking to James Kennedy, who wrote Dare to Know. Dare to Know is a future, I don't want to say dystopian because he just puts that on everything, but it's a potential future where we have determined how to calculate the exact moment that someone will die. The main character is a salesman that is selling this service to very wealthy people. And he has a near-death experience in the early part of the book. And he's like, wow, like I could have died. And then you're not supposed to do this if you're a salesman and practitioner of it. But he does the algorithm on himself, and he just determines that he was supposed to have died during that incident. So the book explores what could happen when you live beyond your expiration date. And it gets very, very, very weird. And it also explores, I'm looking forward to speaking with him because there is a real Native American tribe around Arizona, I believe. And he uses some of that history that inspires the story. And there was a lot of mystery about what happened with that tribe. So that'll be an interesting conversation. We also, one last plug for this book, there was a scene in the book that was not important to the story, but it was a very specific situation that happened to me. And also, so I reached out, I'm like, oh, Mike, this happened to me. He's like, oh, this also happened to me. So the author, myself, and the character in the book all had this very specific, embarrassing situation. So tune into that event to find out what that situation was. And then next week on Thursday, the day after James Kennedy, we won't be talking to Joe Pera, but we are participating with a few other bookstores launching a bathroom book for people not pooping or peeing, but using the bathroom as an escape. It is by Joe Pera and illustrated by Joe Bennett. Joe Pera, I find him to be one of the funniest comedians out there. He's been on Seth Meyers, Stephen Colbert. He has season 3 of his show, Joe Pera Talks with You, is on Adult Swim. He's just really weird guy, but just hilarious. The book is great. For this event, pre-purchase of the book is required to get access to the event. You would get a copy of the book that is signed, and then access to the event. So you can place those orders on our website. If you go to our website and click on the events tab, you'll see the link there. But I will also accept, if you don't want a physical copy of the book, if you download the audiobook version, which I have listened to several times. It's only 15 minutes long, and it relaxes you. It's so great. You can send us proof of that purchase, and I will make sure you get access to that event. Kayla, thank you for sitting through all of those plugs.
No worries. These books sound really cool.
Yeah, Joe Pera he's an oddball, and a Western New Yorker, which is where we are from. But yeah, thank you all for your participation in enjoying. I'm telling you that you are enjoying the I'm assuming.
I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you for enjoying this.
Thank you. Yeah, really.
Thank you, Kayla, for chatting. I really enjoyed your book, and I hope several more people will pick it up and enjoy it as well.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for having me today. It was great talking to you.
You too. Have a nice night.
You too.